In the 90s, Mario, Zelda, and Pokemon were a few notable franchises responsible for stripping millions upon millions of Game Boys off the shelves and into the hands of gamers around the world. By the turn of the decade, the handheld market was booming. So this begs the question, where was Resident Evil? Well, we're going to have to take things back to 1995. Where a small team of developers called M4 was born. Originally developing games for bits, Tim Hall and James Cox had plenty of experience with 8-bit and 16-bit titles such as Itchy and Scratchy, Frankenstein, and No Escape. Looking to expand their horizons, they formed their own company, M4. At the time, Capcom was making an overly ambitious remake of RE1 on the Game Boy Color, though that was turning out to be a flop, because the weak portable hardware could only handle so much. This was when Capcom came across an impressive demo of Dino Crisis made by M4 on the GPC. Recruited without hesitation, they were now in charge of the handheld debut of the #1 survival horror franchise, Resident Evil. Producer Tim Hall distinctly remembers Mikami giving his team almost complete creative freedom. All they had to do was follow the story. With only an engineer and a designer on the team, M4 hired a couple of artists. Everything was going smoothly until Mikami requested for a slider bar to be added. The team was quite perplexed at his idea. I mean, this wasn't a cheap Flash game. This was supposed to be a horrific zombie survival shooting game. So why on earth a slider bar? In the end, they had no choice but to trust Mikami. Though how did it turn out? The game was released in June of 2002 called Resident Evil Gaiden. Events take place on a luxury ship called Starlight. Leon was sent on board to investigate the presence of a new BOW. And of course, in classic RE fashion, a virus breaks out, and everyone turns into zombies. Barry Burton was then sent in for the rescue. With the help of an orphan, they set out to aid Leon and neutralize the threat. The plot doesn't sound too bad, right? Well, unfortunately, Gaiden received fairly harsh reviews from both critics and users alike. But let's see why. Mikami's vision for Resident Evil has always been the fear factor and keeping players at the edge of their seats. Though, as you can imagine, doing that on a tiny, barely even 2x2 screen was extremely challenging, if not impossible. The slider bar was Mikami's answer. By accurately timing the markers, players could nail a headshot. He figured this would create tense situations when players were at critical health. And I agree, this was a smart idea, but it was ruined by another aspect: save points. They were random, far and few in between. Rather than getting a tense feeling trying to get through a tight battle, instead, you'd feel the fear of having to backtrack an entire area if you die. That is if your batteries don't die first. Despite nice visuals, the zombies and boss designs were very limited. According to M4, they wanted to transition over to the Game Boy Advance halfway through development in order to amp up the visuals. Turned out, the costs were too high, and they were rejected. Even so, I don't know what's up with the zombie encounter animations. They come right at you, then everything stops for literally a good 3 seconds. Then you push them back. What on earth happened right here? Well, we'll never know. Overall, I felt Gaiden had much more potential, but was sadly hindered by other flaws. Ever since the start of the Resident Evil franchise, Capcom has wanted to create a version for the arcades. Despite their failure to make a breakthrough into the handheld market, will they succeed here? In the early 2000s, the arcade business was flourishing with titles such as Marvel vs. Capcom, Time Crisis, and Tekken. It's no wonder Capcom wanted in as well. Partnering up with Namco in 2001, co-development on a prototype going by the name of Resident Evil Firezone began. The arcade machine used for Firezone is structured based on Gunman Wars, which was one of Namco's older titles. Unlike the wieldable light guns you use in games like the House of the Dead, Capcom decided to go with a mounted gun that acted like a joystick, which would rotate the player's view. Alongside the arcade version, a PS2 version was in the works as well. The game was released in March of 2002 and renamed Resident Evil Survivor 2 Code Veronica. Events are very similar to Code Veronica. Claire gets taken to Rockfort Island prison, meets Steve, and tries to escape. Now, I've never got my hands on the arcade version, but I can tell you right now that Capcom made a big mistake attaching the name Code Veronica to the PS2 version. Because now fans have expectations, and they certainly were not met. One of the biggest problems with the game was the simple act of traveling from one room to the next. Oftentimes, zombie would be placed very close to the door, ready to attack, which leaves you almost no opportunity to react. You'd simply have to take the hits, because there could be enemies outside your field of view. By the time you turn around and look, you're already taking damage. Oh, and once you begin walking down a flight of stairs, the game won't let you stop. Meaning, if a zombie comes, you'll be walking right into it. That makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? If you don't own the GunCon, then I suggest to not even bother. Movement on the PS2 controller feels robotic and clunky. Planning on asking a friend to help you through this mess? Save yourself the time, cause Survivor 2 doesn't support multiplayer. Don't know why the devs didn't consider split screen, given the arcade version was originally made for 2 players. The only redeeming factor is only the music, and as for the voice acting, can't really say much, cause there is none. After the last couple of iffy entries, it's no doubt that Capcom needs to step up their game and give the new consoles a strong RE title. Well, what better way of doing that than by remaking what started it all? The 6th generation was an exciting time for developers. Improved hardware meant the boundaries to their imagination were widened much more. This was definitely good news, but there's a dark side to it. Some developers were so obsessed with making their games look stunningly beautiful that they completely forgot about how it played. Shigeru Miyamoto and Nintendo saw this as a problem as well, which is also the reason why Mikami decided to strike a deal with them to work with Nintendo and make this remake exclusive to the GameCube. Not to say graphical detail wasn't important, oh no. In an interview with the character sculptor, Kenichiro Yoshimura, the balance between light and darkness, all the way to the wrinkle designs on a character's clothing was given extreme attention. At one point, he even started seeing normal people as wireframes on his way to work. Looks like someone needs a bit of therapy. We're not done though. With 70 minutes worth of cutscenes in the game, Capcom had no choice but to outsource the special effects job. They received help from a professional cameraman by the name of Hideaki Gondo. Sound effects and music were also outsourced to a specialized company located in Hollywood called Sound Deluxe. Talk about production value. The game was released in April of 2002, simply called Resident Evil. Plot-wise, everything is pretty much the same. For old-school RE fans, this game was golden, nothing but a completely enhanced version of the original masterpiece. Camera angles and controls are mostly intact to preserve the classic RE experience. With the GameCube's hardware, character movement and facial expressions looked fantastic. At least compared to the robotic movement in the PS1.
What the hell is this?
Interesting thing to note is the original star's outfit design was going to be black, since Yoshimura felt special forces needed dark outfits. But changed his mind shortly after because it turned out looking too sexy. A far cry from their views in 2012. On top of visuals, various gameplay improvements were made as well, like the addition of quick defense items. Everything about this remake sounds amazing, so it must have sold multi-millions, right? Well, unfortunately, no. Turns out the true survival horror genre was a bit more niche than we thought. Not only was this remake intended for longtime RE fans, Mikami wanted to introduce the franchise to the new generation of gamers as well. But, as we all know, his vision of a perfect survival horror game was definitely no walk in the park. Limited ammo, limited saves, and limited health was only prerequisites. Mikami felt players would get the most satisfaction knowing they overcame a challenge with all those constraints. This was true for a number of players, but sales proved this number was small. Majority of gamers found these constraints to be roadblocks, which ultimately turned them away. Mikami realized this firsthand as he saw the sales of his favorite RE title plummet. The commercial failure of the Resident Evil remake would later drive him to create Resident Evil 4.
Very cute.
It's a pity how things turned out for the remake, but Mikami and his team weren't ready to give up on the classic formula just yet. In the works was another game that would tell beginnings of the Resident Evil franchise. The concept sprung to life way back on the N64. Because of the quicker processing time on cartridges versus PS1's CD-ROM, the devs came up with the idea of character swapping, which is quite a brilliant use of the hardware. Though of course, cartridges had their limitations as well, namely capacity. Despite frequent consultations with Nintendo, the team concluded there was no way they could fit the game onto a single cartridge. Luckily, the GameCube was announced shortly after. All the data and graphics had to be redone, while only the concept and story carried over. Though having the RE remake already finished did allow the devs to reuse the same structure for creating backgrounds and character models. Resident Evil 0 was released in November of 2002, only on the GameCube again. So I bet you're wondering, what's with the exclusivity with Nintendo? Well, according to Mikami, big software developers like Capcom have the power to control market with their games. By spreading some RE titles onto Nintendo's consoles, they'll be able to monopolize the survival horror market to a certain degree. Smart move. Smart move. Events in Zero are a direct prequel to Resident Evil 1. A few members of the Bravo team's helicopter crashes on their way to an investigation in the Arklay Mountains. They soon encounter a crash site involving a train. It wasn't long until they realized the mutated creatures that lurked on board. Rebecca Chambers teams up with former Marine Billy Cohen to make it out alive. The rest of the plot reveals how the T-virus came to be, along with the drama that it brought.
My new life.
So, how is the game? Well, taking what was achieved with the remake, I'd have to say, this is the classic RE at its finest. First off, the game looks freaking fantastic. Lighting, shadows, characters, and the environment all looked amazing. A large amount of money was spent on creating the high-resolution cutscenes. According to General Manager Tetsuya Minami, the goal was to make the storytelling more realistic. And yeah, I don't think it can get any more realistic than this on the GameCube. Though, don't let the sweet graphics throw you off. Resident Evil 0 is harder than ever, especially now that the item storage box is removed. Inspired by the same function in Sweet Home, whenever your inventory is full, you'll have to make a trade-off between what items to take and which to drop on the floor. It's definitely an interesting change, but I felt it occasionally led to some tedious backtracking. Though of course, the most anticipated feature is none other than the character swapping. Switching between Rebecca and Billy added a whole new layer of strategy. For example, Rebecca could mix certain herbs and get through tight spaces, while Billy had more strength. It made you think twice about the situation, whether it was solving a puzzle or getting past zombies. Everything sounds fantastic. This game definitely redeemed the poor sales from the remake, right? Unfortunately, no. RE0 did even worse than RE Remake. The answer was clear from Mikami and Capcom. Not enough gamers were interested in the classic Resident Evil formula anymore. It was time to throw in the towel. In the next episode, we'll take a look at what direction Capcom will take one of their best-selling franchises. Can they make a strong comeback, or what will happen? Stay tuned and we'll see you next time.